I got a quick question for you. How many lands are you running in your deck? No, seriously, this is important. So, Altruistic Champion had a question over on Reddit, and that was, remember when all the EDH YouTubers were talking about land counts? How did that influence you? And they pointed out that everybody was saying you should run 40 plus lands, and then you should get rid of some of your ramp to end up running more lands, and then since everybody used to say 37 to 38 is fine, that seemed crazy to them, and well, now we're here. So let's go ahead and talk about that. But first, my name is Suris. If you're unfamiliar with my content, I do budget Magic the Gathering decks, and I try to make them strong enough to dominate tables without dominating your wallet. If that is something that you find value in, then please let me know in the description below, but also consider subscribing to the channel, even though it's a vanity metric these days, and letting a couple friends know what I'm doing over here. That said, let's talk about land counts, and when we do, I want to bring up a couple of my decks that I actually ran this experiment with. But before we do that, we should probably contextualize why we're even talking about this in the first place. So let me direct you to the person's video who actually got me on this particular train, because I was very much a 36 lands and 14 ramp, or 37 lands and 13 ramp type of guy until I started thinking about my decks a little harder. This is the video that got me to rethink how I do mana, and it's from Rebel Lily. Now, if you are not familiar with Rebel Lily, she's a creator I've been watching for a while who uses VTuber models for fun skits, and also just happens to be a member of the Commander Format panel. So she has some insight into the actual design process for Commander going forward, because, well, that's just kind of a privilege the Commander Format panel gets. In her video, she actually came to about 43 lands being the optimal amount of lands for a commander deck, and this kind of fucked with me for a little while, because how in the world do you get to 43 lands? Now, the way she described getting to this number is not by using her own super powerful brain, though she is pretty smart. No, the way she got to this was by using math, and specifically the same math that professional Magic the Gathering players use in order to figure out how many lands a deck should be running. They used a tool called a hypergeometric calculator to figure out if you're trying to get to a certain number of lands in your opening hand to have access to everything that you want, then, well, there's a literal way to figure out how many of those lands you should be running in a deck to get to that number. And if a good amount of lands in an opening hand is 4, then, well, with 43 lands in your deck, suddenly you have a really, really good chance of getting to that number. Now, I'm the kind of person who will argue at length about something that I disagree with, and I disagreed with this. I wanted to argue at length about how, despite the math, this just doesn't really seem necessary when we have access to mana rocks, but that's also something she addressed in her video. The point that if you're having to spend 2 mana in order to get a mana rock, then you're not actually getting ahead on mana if you also missed a land drop during that turn. So your ramp needs to be calculated separately. And to try to take this to its extreme, I actually took one of my favorite decks, Sephiroth, and I built it without a ramp base. I went with running 40 lands, with only a Sad Robot and a Wayfarer's Bauble to be my extra lands in the deck. I didn't want to have Arcane Signet or Soul Ring or anything like that in the deck at all, so I wanted to see how the deck would play out if none of the cards available, with the exception of the Wayfarer's Bauble, actually accelerated me to any of my main strategies. And what I found was that by having a consistent land drop every single turn, I was basically getting to everything I wanted to do in that deck. Now, this didn't really apply to decks like Ruby that are big mana decks that desperately want to get to 4 mana as soon as possible so that they can start casting bigger spells. So in those decks, ramp was still necessary, but in decks like Sephiroth and even my Terra deck, I just didn't need access to the ramp. And there is something she mentioned in her video as well. There were ways to cheat the mana base in order to make sure that you had access to as many lands as you could possibly need without actually having to worry about filling your deck up with lands and therefore having dead draws. And this was, of course, by using the land cycling creatures. For every land cycle creature you have in your deck, that is effectively another land that you have access to. Now, she specifically means using the Lord of the Rings ones that only cost 1 mana, so that they don't actually disrupt your curve too terribly much, but honestly, many of these will do their job really well. And after all, what's the difference between paying 2 mana to Plane Cycle and Angel of the Ruins and get a card you need while also putting an important card in the grave to reanimate, and just missing a land drop and therefore paying 2 mana for an Arcane Signet? As far as I'm concerned, you get the same effect either way when you're on the back foot. And then, of course, like I said, cards like Troll of Khazad-dûm just make this way easier in general. So, in response to that, I started actually experimenting more with rampless decks that just simply didn't have access to any real form of ramp at all, to see what would happen, with the underlying idea being, if I am spending a turn, that turn should be spent not preparing for an eventual better turn, but simply spent building up my main game plan. Enter Terra. She is Sephiroth in every meaningful way, except she is Mardu colors instead of being Esper colors. But as far as I'm concerned, she is the same commander. And what was the game plan of this deck? In an ideal world, my turn 2 should be playing something like Fear of Missing Out, or Ripples of Undeath, or playing an off-curve Citrus Supplier to prep for the turn my commander comes out, and not spending any of that mana on, well, mana rocks. Using that 2 mana for a Lightning Greaves, or a Swiftfoot Boots, or a Jarina, or a Selfless Spirit, which is in some people's version of the deck. I got comments about that, so I wanted to mention it. But the idea was simple. Playing a card like this, or this, is just infinitely more impactful to my ultimate game plan than playing an Arcane Signet. It didn't actually benefit me in any way to get that mana ramp early, when really, my commander costs 3 and her effect costs 2. I could just lower the curve of my deck, and suddenly I don't need to worry about any of that shenanigans at all. If my high mana reanimation spells like Sister Hospitaller and Olivia Crimson Bride are being summoned with the commander, then their mana costs don't really matter. And if my lower mana costs like Necromancy, Reanimate, and Animate Dead are all below that curve, then I just don't need that extra mana from an Arcane Signet at all. And this is where I decided to build something on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. What if, instead of using my usual game knowledge that I'd accumulated over my time playing Commander, what if instead of using that, where I'm playing a deck with a bunch of 2 mana ramps like Nature's Lore and stuff like that, because those are the good mana ramps, what if I just had a commander doing that job for me? The seed of this idea got dropped in my head because I watched Trinket Mage and Salubrious Snail, and I don't remember which one of them mentioned a Rada deck that did something similar to this, but that gave me the idea to play Ruby Daring Tracker as just an Arcane Signet in the command zone with a twist. You see, I could just play her as my 2 mana rock and then play 3 mana cards and play a aggressive aggro deck, but if I'm in green, I want to play Quartzwood Crasher, I want to play Endray's Forerunners, I want to drop Omnath Logos of Rage on the battlefield and do lots of damage to you. So what do we get from that? Well, we get a deck that has 42 lands and a ton of 4 mana ramp. Cartographer Survey, Circuitous Route, Explosive Vegetation. If you can think of a 4 mana ramp card that's in green, I've probably jammed it in this deck somewhere. But even with all that extra ramp, Ruby is sitting at a clean 42 lands. And, well, that's because I never want to be missing a mana drop. This deck has such an absurdly high mana curve that I am up to that upper echelon of amount of lands I could be jamming in a deck. So that was my experience reshaping my mana bases around this math that I originally wanted to argue against, because I agree with the OP here. Nobody wants to cut good and fun cards out of their deck for lands. But the alternative to that is recognizing that you can't cast any of those good or fun cards unless you have the lands in the first place. So they mentioned here that going up to 40 or more is a big ask. And I'm going to be honest, I used to agree with that, and then I realized that's not really true. So I'm going to bang a drum that I've banged a billion times again here. These are MDFCs. Meet Bridgeworks Battle, a fight spell that costs 3 mana. It's also an untapped land. Or Colony Ambush, a fight spell that costs 3 mana that's also a tapped land. Or Stump Stomp, a pseudo-fight spell, a deal damage directly spell that is a dual land on the backside. Valakut Awakening, a very powerful draw spell that, well, is a land on the backside, or Disciple of Freyalise, an equally powerful draw spell that is also a land on the backside. So I don't really think you have to cut fun stuff for lands. You just need to make sure that some of the cards that you consider fun are MDFCs, or that alternatively, they're cards like Angel of the Ruins that you can cycle away to get a land when you would otherwise be missing one. We get a lot of conversation in the Commander community of Magic the Gathering here on YouTube about having to eat your vegetables because that is important for making a good deck build. And there are people that are not super happy about that advice, but that advice is always coming generally from a place of somebody wanting to make your deck better, wanting to make it a little more efficient, because when your deck is a little better or a little more efficient, you get to actually have fun with it, as opposed to sitting around hoping that you could cast spells. And to kind of illuminate this, I want to give you a story from a friend of mine who tried to do the exact opposite of this. You see, they really like Infect, and they built this deck right here. And I'm sure I just caused some toes to curl as soon as they saw Skithiryx the Blight Dragon, but he's not going to hurt you yet. He's just kind of a dumb dude. In fact, actually, I think I might need a copy for my dragon deck, because I'm a terrible person. That said, Skithiryx is a commander who causes people to freak out because, well, he causes infect damage, and it's super easy to get his power up to the 9s and just knock somebody out in a single hit with infect, and nobody likes being deleted that quick out of a game. So in order to try to make this commander more palatable, my friend cut most of the lands out of his deck. He was running with something like 22 or 23 lands with Skithiryx, and all this ended up doing was meaning that sometimes he drew the God Hand, and his deck was able to get Skithiryx out on like turn 2, shit out a card to double or even triple its power, and then suddenly Skithiryx was punching for game on somebody on turn 4 or even 5 if it was going slowly. And the rest of the time, the deck just simply didn't fucking work. And this was something that caused him to not really enjoy the deck all that much, outside of liking the fact that it was a Skithiryx deck. So what was the actual answer here? How do you make this deck more fun for more people at the table? Well, it's simple. You get rid of the aspect of Skithiryx that causes people the actual headache, and that is the one-shot kills. If Skithiryx has to hit you 3 times or even twice to do his effect, then he's really no different than any other Elder Dragon at that point, and it's really not as bad to deal with him at the table. If I at least have a chance to respond to the Skithiryx, then that's fine. But if I'm playing against a deck that is chock full with all the tutors to do the one-turn kills with Skithiryx, and I'm just hoping that you happen to not draw the lands, then we're gonna come up with more frustrating games. They're just not gonna happen as often. Changing this deck to where it has plenty of lands to do its stuff consistently, but it doesn't operate as quickly because it doesn't have the same access to the explosive hands, suddenly means that the deck gets to participate in more real games, and it got to just be a deck that people didn't freak out about as much. Sure, they're worried about Skithiryx in general, but at the end of the day, it's nowhere near as bad as, oops, he got his soul ring and his tutor, guess we die. But don't just take my word for it, because I'm a YouTuber who could be lying to you just to get you to say things in my comment section because I get a direct financial benefit from that. Consider just using a hypergeometric calculator to see what those numbers look like, and I think this is where you're going to see the breadth of how this works. For instance, in my Terra deck, I want 3 lands in my opening hand. So if I tell the calculator that I have 3 successes in the sample, and my population size, there are 40 lands in my deck, and I have 12 as my sample size. That's to tell you what my mulligan, like, that's starting hand plus a mulligan, effectively. I have a 93% chance of getting a usable hand in here. And if I just use my sample size as 7, I still have about a 60% chance to get what I want in my very, very opening hand. And that's pretty good. If I get that number up to 43, then it's a 65% chance. So the math says that you will have more live games if you have more lands in your deck in general. And my personal experience is that that's been the case for me, both with running decks that have gigantic ramp bases and decks that have 0 ramp bases whatsoever. The answer was always the same: run more lands. And as a side note, running more lands incentivizes you to run more MDFCs, because when you run more MDFCs, you run into hands that are filled with usable spells, even if they are technically all lands. Because the worst thing anybody can deal with is mana flooding, and MDFCs solve that problem for you. But there is a bit here in the Reddit thread that I think I probably need to actually make a video on, and it's about having better mulligans. Said, please expand on what this person was saying in that, you know, they want to be able to consistently hit their mana drops and they need to mulligan aggressively to make sure that they can get that. So we have I Am King of Kings saying, please expand on this. I read a bunch about being better at mulligans, but I don't see much content about how to improve. I understand the basics, get enough lands and have a hand that has a plan, but man, it seems like when I do mulligan, it gets worse. Do you have any tips or tricks? And you know what? I think that's probably something that I need to do as my next video. We're going to make a video all about mulligans, and I'm going to use a couple of decks for me. Probably Ruby, Sephiroth, and a couple other ones. Some combo, some tempo, some mid-range, and some aggro decks, so that we see what a good mulligan looks like for each and every kind of deck. And it's all going to be decks that I've made videos on the channel, so if you want to see a creator idea on how to actually play those decks, then you'll have access to all of that as well. But I guess I'll end this with saying that, yeah, the giant content creator boom of everybody talking about running more lands in your deck made me run more lands in my deck, and after running more lands in my deck, all of my decks started performing better. And suddenly, the decks that I had that felt like they were performing badly were the ones that I hadn't updated since I started running more lands in my decks. The decks that were sitting at 36 or 37 lands were the ones that were performing worse than the ones that were running 40 to 42 lands. And yeah, even those 3 extra lands were making a difference in guaranteeing that I had live games. So the end result of this is I heeded the advice, not wanting to keep all of my fun cards, and then just having more fun games because my decks were working better. Weird. But what about you? How many lands do you run in your deck, and have there been any things that have influenced that number? Is it because you run, say, aristocrat decks that run really, really low mana curves? Or do you like big mana stuff and that affects the amount of lands you're running in your deck? Understand that one size does not fit all with most of these decks in general, but a good baseline to shoot for is however many lands you need to get your deck up and running. If I'm running an aristocrats deck, I probably only need 2 lands in my opening hand to actually work, and if I'm running 43 lands, then I've got effectively a 100% chance to get those lands if I account for mulligans. But if I, say, lower that mana count down to, say, 36, suddenly that number only drops by 2%. I now have the ability to add an entire suite of new cards, 6 whole new cards into the deck, and I've only dropped the efficiency down by a handful of percentage points because the deck can run off of so few lands. But if we're talking about my Ruby deck wants to see 3 lands instead, so that number looks very different. It drops down by another almost 10% when I do that. So, yeah, the takeaway from here is not running more lands is necessary for everybody. The takeaway from here is that we should be analyzing our decks better to figure out how many lands we should be running. It just so happens that in my case, the answer was almost always unilaterally that I should have been running more lands in general. But again, what about you? How many are you running? Why are you running them? And what kind of decks do you like to play that incentivize those mana counts? Let me know in the description below, or in the comment section below. I keep saying description. Jesus, that's weird. Anyway, let me know in the comment section below, and I will see you all in the next one. I've got a video on the Emperor of Palmesia going up soon, and we'll have a video about how to mulligan better coming up soon as well.